are short-sighted. This session will address the question, how does dismantling of public pensions ultimately impact state and local revenues? We often hear from our opponents that taxpayers cannot afford public pensions. The data does not support this assertion. Dr. Michael Kahn, with NCPERS Director of our research, will show that revenues generated through spending of pension checks and investments of pension assets far exceed taxpayer contributions to public pensions. Please welcome Dr. Michael Kahn.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, everybody. I want to start by saying good morning. Good morning. I know after listening to almost 2 hours and 15 minutes from different experts, UBIT and all other kind of stuff, one can begin to sort of doze off a little bit, but we are almost close to the end of this first session. And it reminds me of a story about two people. One was a taxi driver from New York, and another was a religious leader, a pastor or a priest, somebody. They were both in heaven. And I didn't know there are different levels in heaven. There is one level is business class, and there is an economy class. So there are two levels in heaven. The taxi driver was in the upper level, business class, and the religious leader was in the lower class. So the religious leaders sort of complained that how come, I'm a leader of a religious group, I'm a pastor, and this guy is a taxi driver, and he has a higher level than me. So he filed a complaint, and the angel said, well, let me go and check it out, why this is so. And the next day, the answer came and said, Pastor, when you are speaking, you are giving your sermon, half the people are asleep. And the taxi driver actually, when they are sitting there, not only they are awake, but they are always saying, oh my God, oh my God. And so hopefully we stay awake for the next 15 minutes of my presentation. So on a serious note, it's a pleasure and an honor to share with you my latest research, and thanks to NCPERS for continuing to be the sponsor of this kind of research. All of you should have a copy of this paper. You can see the arrows coming at the nest egg of the people you protect, and you are holding the umbrella to protect that. So that's really an amazing job that you do. You not only protect the pensions of people, workers, you also actually build communities. We had a session earlier in a pre-conference session in which there were a lot of examples given how your work actually is a work of building communities and our economy. Because you make sure that our police officers and firefighters who put their lives on the line every day to protect our communities will have a dignified transition to retirement. You make sure that the teacher who is teaching a homeless child is going to have a retirement that he'll not live or she will not live in poverty. You make sure that state and local workers who keep our parks and roads clean will not be forgotten in their retirement. So your work goes, unrecognized and not really on the front pages glorified. So I want to take this moment to thank you. I think each of you you deserve a lot of thanks for what you do. I want to give you a big hand. Thank you. So you have the report that makes my job easier. Just I'll give you a quick overview of what I found. I was sort of getting tired of listening that taxpayers cannot afford public pensions. And so as a researcher, being a nerd, I thought, well, why don't I look at the data and see what it shows? So I started looking at about 40 years of data for each of the 50 states to sort of, is there any way we can support, or is this really a true assertion that taxpayers cannot afford public pension? And what the bottom line is, what I found is that actually the truth is reverse of what we hear. If the public pensions, when you cut public pensions, you actually increase tax burden on taxpayers. And I'll show you, we'll go through how that math works. But this is sort of should be a wake-up call for policymakers who are constantly trying to dismantle slowly and steadily public pension defined benefit plans. And without realizing that, or we should tell them that by your action, you are going to increase tax burden on your constituents. You should be aware of that, and this is the data that we could share. I tried to do it state by state, so you can use in your states as you go along. So our research, basically we started with the question of, as I said, looking at the opponents of public pensions often argue that taxpayers cannot afford to pay for public pensions. But common sense tells us that spending of pension checks and investment of pension assets. So there are two ways you impact the economy. One is the pension checks when they are spent, and the second is when the pension assets are invested. They both impact economy and revenues. When the economy grows, the revenues grow. And when the economy turns the other way, the revenues decline. So this is a common, and we hear this all the time when the other side, when they want to cut taxes, they say that people will have more money, they'll spend and invest, and the economy will grow. But it seems like the pension money, they don't believe it grows the economy or revenue. Maybe the pension money, the color is different, or maybe the size of the pension money, the dollar is smaller somehow. There's no logic to what we hear. So the research question, basic question I was trying to answer in this research is, do state and local revenues generated by public pension exceed taxpayer contribution to public pensions? And our hypothesis is that they do. So as I mentioned, I looked at historical data from various public sources. Sometimes people would say, well, you work for NCPERS and maybe you cook up some numbers from here and there, but we use actually the census data, Census of Government, Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics information to build a model that would measure the impact of pensions, two pieces of the pensions, like the retiree spending and the investment of pension fund assets. We have in the past done research. You heard from this morning from Treasurer Di Napoli about the NERS study, the National Institute on Retirement Security. And some of your pension plans also do studies showing the positive impact of pension check spending. But there hasn't been any study done on the impact of investment of pension assets. So here we actually add the second element. So we add them up, the pension check spending as well as the pension fund assets, impact of both of these, and estimated the economic as well as tax consequences of pension funds for state and local governments. So the findings highlights, I think you have, first day, they were also mentioned during our president's, NCPERS President Daniel Fortuna's address. For each $1,000 of pension fund assets invested, create an economic impact of $1,088. So there is a small but very significant impact because of the size of the assets. Because we really have like about $3.7 trillion of state and local pension fund assets invested in the economy. Now, some of it is in national companies, some are international, but the impact, the model we built is the impact can be traced back to individual states. And I guess as researchers, we like to test it out, send it out for a peer review, people who have same expertise, economists like myself, to see if we are on the right track. And so we sent it out to about 7 or so people in different universities, and it came back with some good feedback, and I modified the model a little bit. And we are hoping we'll do this every year or every 2. Anytime the new data becomes available, we'll have this continuously presented or at least published for your use. So overall, the investment of pension fund assets contributed about $587 billion to the economy in 2016. 2016 is the latest data that we have. The new data will come out later this year or next year, so we'll do another one to continue this. So this $587 billion resulted in about $125 billion in state and local revenues. So that's a pretty big amount. Again. Similarly, the other part, as I mentioned, there are 2 parts. The second part, which we already have some research that was mentioned this morning, the spending of checks, pension checks by retirees, that impact local economies. That generated about $757 billion and $151 billion in revenues. So when we add these 2 up, that's a pretty big number. It turns out that economy, out of our 16 trillion or so, economy I'm measuring with the personal income. So total personal income is about $16 trillion, out of which 1.3 trillion was a result of pension fund assets and spending by retirees of their pension checks. And that generated $277 billion. So here we have the $277 billion generated by pension funds, and taxpayers' contribution to state and local pension plans was, in 2016, was $140 billion. That means that just because pension funds are around, they generated about $137 billion more than taxpayers paid. So this is really a very significant turnaround from the argument that taxpayers cannot afford public pension. The argument, actually, the data shows otherwise. So if you have a legislator, a friend who might be thinking about, we can't afford public pensions, just tell them, well, if you change this from DB to a DC plan, you are going to increase tax burden on your constituents. So that's really the bottom line of this research, and there's try to make it very simple for you to understand. But if you want to know more, it's all in here. Thank you so much.